Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. This evening, we're reading one of the original works of science fiction and fantasy. It's the description of a new world called the Blazing World, written by the thrice noble, illustrious, and excellent princess, Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle, printed by A. Maxwell in the year 1668. Let's begin. To the Duchess of Newcastle on her new blazing world, our elder world, with all their skill and arts, could but divide the world into three parts. Columbus, then for navigation famed, found a new world, America 'tis named. Now this new world was found, it was not made, only discovered, lying in time's shade. Then what are you, having no chaos found, to make a world or any such least ground? But your creating fancy thought it fit to make your world of nothing but pure wit. Your blazing world beyond the stars mounts higher, enlightens all with a celestial fire. William Newcastle. To all noble and worthy ladies, this present description of a new world was made as an appendix to my observations upon experimental philosophy, and having some sympathy and coherence with each other, were joined together as two several worlds at their two poles. But, by reason most ladies take no delight in philosophical arguments, I separated some from the mentioned observations, and caused them to go out by themselves, that I might express my respects in presenting to them such fancies as my contemplations did afford. The first part is romancical, the second philosophical, and the third is merely fancy, or as I may call it, fantastical. And if, noble ladies, you should chance to take pleasure in reading these fancies, I shall account myself a happy creatoress. If not, I must be content to live a melancholy life in my own world, which I cannot call a poor world, if poverty be only want of gold and jewels. For there is more gold in it than all the chemists ever made, or, as I verily believe, will ever be able to make. As for the rocks of diamonds, I wish with all my soul they might be shared amongst the noble female friends, upon which condition I would willingly quit my part, and of the gold I should desire only so much as might suffice to repair my noble lord and husband's losses, for I am not covetous, but as ambitious as ever any of my sex was, is, or can be, which is the cause that though I cannot be Henry V or Charles II, yet I will endeavor to be Margaret I, and though I have neither power, time, nor occasion to be a great conqueror like Alexander or Caesar, yet rather than not be mistress of a world, since fortune and the fates would give me none, I have made one of my own, and thus believing, or at least hoping, that no creature can or will envy me for this world of mine, I remain, noble ladies, your humble servant, Margaret Newcastle. The description of a new world called the Blazing World. A merchant traveling into a foreign country fell extremely in love with a young lady, but being a stranger in that nation and beneath her in both birth and wealth, he could have but little hopes of obtaining his desire. However, his love growing more and more vehement upon him, even to the slighting of all difficulties, he resolved at last to steal her away, which he had the better opportunity to do, because his father's house was not far from the sea, and she often using to gather shells upon the shore, accompanied not with above 2 to 3 of her servants, it encouraged him the more to execute his design, thus coming one time with a little light vessel not unlike a packet boat, manned with some few seamen and well victualled, for fear of some accidents which might perhaps retard their journey. To the place where she used to repair, he forced her away. But when he fancied himself the happiest man of the world, he proved to be the most unfortunate. For heaven, frowning at his theft, raised such a tempest as they knew not what to do, or whither to steer their course, so that the vessel, both by its own lightness and the violent motion of the wind, was carried as swift as an arrow out of a bow towards the North Pole, and in a short time reached the icy sea, where the wind forced it amongst huge pieces of ice. But being little and light, it did by the assistance and favor of the gods to this virtuous lady so turn and wind through those precipices as if it had been guided by some experienced pilot and skilful mariner. But alas, those few men which were in it, not knowing whither they went, nor what was to be done in so strange an adventure, and not being provided for so cold a voyage, were all frozen to death, the young lady only, by the light of her beauty, the heat of her youth, and protection of the gods, remaining alive. Neither was it a wonder that the men did freeze to death, for they were not only driven to the very end or point of the pole of that world, but even to another pole of another world which joined close to it, so that the cold, having a double strength at the conjunction of those two poles, was insupportable. At last, the boat, still passing on, was forced into another world, for it is impossible to go round this world's globe from pole to pole as we do from east to west, because the poles of the other world, joining to the poles of this, do not allow any further passage to surround the world that way. But if anyone arrives to either of these poles, he is either forced to return or to enter into another world. And lest you should scruple at it, and think if it were thus, those that live at the poles would either see two suns at one time, or else they would never want the sun's light for 6 months together, as is commonly believed. You must know that each of these worlds, having its own sun to enlighten it, they move each one in their peculiar circles, which motion is so just and exact that neither can hinder or obstruct the other, for they do not exceed their tropics. And although they should meet, yet we in this world cannot so well perceive them, by reason of the brightness of our sun, which being nearer to us, obstructs the splendor of the sun of the other world, they being too far off to be discerned by our optic perception, except when we use very good telescopes, by which skillful astronomers have often observed 2 or 3 suns at once. But to return to the wandering boat and the distressed lady, she, seeing all the men dead, found small comfort in life. Their bodies, which were preserved all that while from putrefaction and stench by the extremity of cold, began now to thaw and corrupt, whereupon she, having not strength enough to fling them overboard, was forced to remove out of her small cabin upon the deck, to avoid the nauseous smell, and finding the boat swim between 2 plains of ice, as a stream that runs betwixt 2 shores, at last perceived land, but covered all with snow, from which came, walking upon the ice, strange creatures in shape like bears, only they went upright as men. Those creatures, coming near the boat, catched hold of it with their paws that served them instead of hands. Some 2 or 3 of them entered first, and when they came out, the rest went in one after another. At last, having viewed and observed all that was in the boat, they spake to each other in a language which the lady did not understand, and having carried her out of the boat, sunk it together with the dead men. The lady, now finding herself in so strange a place and amongst such wonderful kind of creatures, was extremely struck with fear, and could entertain no other thoughts, but that every moment her life was to be a sacrifice to their cruelty. But those bear-like creatures, how terrible soever they appeared to her sight, Yet were they so far from exercising any cruelty upon her, that rather they showed her all civility and kindness imaginable. For she, being not able to go upon the ice by reason of its slipperiness, they took her up in their rough arms, and carried her into their city, where instead of houses they had caves underground. And as soon as they entered the city, both males and females, young and old, flocked together to see this lady, holding up their paws in admiration. At last, having brought her into a certain large and spacious cave, which they intended for her reception, they left her to the custody of the females, who entertained her with all kindness and respect, and gave her such victuals as they used to eat. But seeing her constitution neither agreed with the temper of that climate nor their diet, they were resolved to carry her into another island of a warmer temper, in which were men like foxes, only walking in an upright shape, who received their neighbors the bear men with great civility and courtship. Very much admiring this beauteous lady, and having discoursed some while together, agreed at last to make her a present to the emperor of their world, to which end, after she had made some short stay in the same place, they brought her across that island to a large river, whose stream runs smooth and clear like crystal, in which were numerous boats, much like our fox traps, in one whereof she was carried, some of the bear and foxmen waiting on her. And as soon as they had crossed the river, they came into an island where there were men which had heads, beaks, and feathers like wild geese, only they went in an upright shape, like the bearmen and foxmen. Their rumps they carried between their legs. Their wings were of the same length with their bodies, and their tails of an indifferent size, trailing after them like a lady's garment. And after the bear and foxmen had declared their intention and design to their neighbors, the geese or birdmen, some of them joined to the rest, and attended the lady through that island, till they came to another great and large river, where there was a preparation made of many boats, much like birds' nests, only of a bigger size. And having crossed that river, they arrived into another island, which was of a pleasant and mild temper, full of woods, and the inhabitants thereof were satyrs, who received both the bear, fox, and birdmen with all respect and civility. And after some conferences, for they all understood each other's language, some chief of the satyrs joining to them, accompanied the lady out of that island to another river, wherein were many handsome and commodious barges. And having crossed that river, they entered into a large and spacious kingdom, the men whereof were of a grass-green complexion, who entertained them very kindly, and provided all conveniences for their further voyage. Hitherto they had only crossed rivers, but now they could not avoid the open seas any longer, whereof they made their ships and tacklings ready to sail over into the island where the emperor of the blazing world, for so it was called, kept his residence. Very good navigators they were, and though they had no knowledge of the lodestone, or needle or pendulous watches, yet, which was it serviceable to them, they had subtle observations and great practice, in so much that they could not only tell the depth of the sea at every place, but where there were shells of sand, rocks, and other obstructions to be avoided by skillful and experienced seamen. Besides, they were excellent augurers, which skill they counted more necessary and beneficial than the use of compasses, cards, watches, and the like. But above the rest, they had an extraordinary art, much to be taken notice of by experimental philosophers, and that was a certain engine which could draw in a great quantity of air and shoot forth wind with a great force. This engine in a calm they placed behind their ships, and in a storm before, for it served against the raging waves like cannons against a hostile army or besieged town. It would batter and beat the waves in pieces, were they as high as steeples, and as soon as a breach was made, they forced their passage through, in spite even of the most furious wind, using 2 of those engines at every ship, one before to beat off the waves, and another behind to drive it on, so that the artificial wind had the better of the natural, for it had a greater advantage of the waves than the natural of the ships. The natural being above the face of the water could not without a downright motion enter or press into the ships, whereas the artificial with a sideward motion did pierce into the bowels of the waves. Moreover, it is to be observed that in a great tempest they would join their ships in battle array, and when they feared wind and waves would be too strong for them if they divided their ships, they joined as many together as the compass or advantage of the places of the liquid element would give them leave, for their ships were so ingeniously contrived that they could fasten them together as close as a honeycomb without waste of place. And being thus united, no wind nor waves were able to separate them. The emperor's ships were all of gold, but the merchants and skippers of leather. The golden ships were not much heavier than ours of wood, by reason they were neatly made, and required not such thickness, neither were they troubled with pitch, tar, pumps, guns, and the like, which make our wooden ships very heavy. Yet they were so well soldered that there was no fear of leaks, chinks, or clefts. And as for guns, there were no use of them, because they had no other enemies but the winds. But the leather ships were not altogether so sure, although much lighter. Besides, they were pitched to keep out water. Having thus prepared and ordered their navy, they went on in despite of calm or storm. And though the lady at first fancied herself in a very sad condition, and her mind was much tormented with doubts and fears, not knowing whether this strange adventure would tend to her safety or destruction, yet she being withal of a generous spirit and ready wit, considering what dangers she had passed, and finding these sorts of men civil and diligent attendants to her, took courage and endeavored to learn their language, which after she had obtained so far that partly by some words and signs she was able to apprehend their meaning, she was so far from being afraid of them that she thought herself not only safe but very happy in their company, by which we may see that novelty discomposes the mind, but acquaintance settles it in peace and tranquillity. At last, having passed by several rich islands and kingdoms, they went towards Paradise, which was the seat of the emperor, and coming in sight of it, rejoiced very much. The lady at first could perceive nothing but high rocks, which seemed to touch the skies, and although they appeared not of an equal height, yet they seemed to be all of one piece, without partitions. But at last, drawing nearer, she perceived a cliff, which was a part of those rocks, out of which she spied coming forth a great number of boats, which afar off showed like a company of ants marching one after another. The boats appeared like the holes or partitions in a honeycomb, and when joined together stood as close. The men were of several complexions, but none like any of our world. And when both the boats and ships met, they saluted and spake to each other very courteously, for there was but one language in all that world, nor no more but one emperor, to whom they all submitted with the greatest duty and obedience, which made them live in a continued peace and happiness, not acquainted with foreign wars or homebred insurrections. The lady, now being arrived at this place, was carried out of her ship into one of those boats, and conveyed through the same passage, for there was no other, into that part of the world where the emperor did reside, which part was very pleasant and of a mild temper. Within itself it was divided by a great number of vast and large rivers, all ebbing and flowing into several islands of unequal distance from each other, which in most parts were as pleasant, healthful, rich, and fruitful as nature could make them, and as I mentioned before, secure from all foreign invasions, by reason there was but one way to enter, and that like a labyrinth, so winding and turning among the rocks that no other vessels but small boats could pass, carrying not above 3 passengers at a time. On each side, all along the narrow and winding river, there were several cities, some of marble, some of alabaster, some of agate, some of amber, some of coral, and some of other precious materials not known in our world, all which after the lady had passed, she came to the imperial city named Paradise, which appeared in form like several islands, for rivers did run betwixt every street, which together with the bridges, whereof there was a great number, were all paved. The city itself was built of gold, and their architectures were noble, stately, and magnificent, not like our modern, but like those in the Romans' time. For our modern buildings are like those houses which children use to make of cards, one story above another, fitter for birds than men. But theirs were more large and broad than high. The highest of them did not exceed 2 stories, besides those rooms that were underground as cellars and other offices. The emperor's palace stood upon an indifferent ascent from the imperial city, at the top of which ascent was a broad arch supported by several pillars which went round the palace, and contained 4 of our English miles in compass. Within the arch stood the emperor's guard, which consisted of several sorts of men. At every half-mile was a gate to enter, and every gate was of a different fashion. The first, which allowed a passage from the imperial city into the palace, had on either hand a cloister, the outward part whereof stood upon arches sustained by pillars, but the inner part was close. Being entered through the gate, the palace itself appeared in its middle like the aisle of a church, 1.5 miles long, and 1/2 mile broad. The roof of it was all arched, and rested upon pillars, so artificially placed that a stranger would lose himself therein without a guide. At the extreme sides, that is, between the outward and inward part of the cloister, were lodgings for attendants, and in the midst of the palace the emperor's own rooms, whose lights were placed at the top of every one because of the heat of the sun. The emperor's apartment for state was no more enclosed than the rest. Only an imperial throne was in every apartment, of which the several adornments could not be perceived until one entered, because the pillars were so just opposite to one another that all the adornments could not be seen at once. The first part of the palace was, as the imperial city, all of gold, and when it came to the emperor's apartment, it was so rich with diamonds, pearls, rubies, and the like precious stones, that it surpasses my skill to enumerate them all. Amongst the rest, the imperial room of state appeared most magnificent. It was paved with green diamonds, for there are in that world diamonds of all colors, so artificially as it seemed but of one piece. The pillars were set with diamonds so close and in such a manner that they appeared most glorious to the sight. Between every pillar was a bow or arch of a certain sort of diamonds, the like whereof our world does not afford, which being placed in every one of the arches in several rows, seemed just like so many rainbows of several different colors. The roof of the arches was of blue diamonds, and in the midst thereof was a carbuncle which represented the sun, and the rising and setting sun of the east and west side of the room were made of rubies. Out of this chamber there was a passage into the emperor's bedchamber, the walls whereof were of jet, and the floor of black marble. The roof was of mother of pearl, where the moon and blazing stars were represented by white diamonds, and his bed was made of diamonds and carbuncles. No sooner was the lady brought before the emperor, but he conceived her to be some goddess, and offered to worship her, which she refused, telling him, for by that time she had pretty well learned their language, that although she came out of another world, yet was she but mortal, at which the emperor rejoicing made her his wife, and gave her an absolute power to rule and govern all that world as she pleased. But her subjects, who could hardly be persuaded to believe her mortal, tendered her all the veneration and worship due to a deity. Her accoutrement after she was made empress was as followeth. On her head she wore a cap of pearl and a half-moon of diamonds just before it. On the top of her crown came spreading over a broad carbuncle, cut in the form of the sun. Her coat was of pearl mixed with blue diamonds and fringed with red ones. Her buskins and sandals were of green diamonds. In her left hand she held a buckler to signify the defense of her dominions, which buckler was made of that sort of diamond as has several different colors, and being cut and made in the form of an arch, showed like a rainbow. In her right hand she carried a spear made of white diamond, cut like the tail of a blazing star, which signified that she was ready to assault those that proved her enemies. None was allowed to use or wear gold but those of the imperial race, which were the only nobles of the state, nor durst anyone wear jewels but the emperor, the empress, and their eldest son, notwithstanding that they had an infinite quantity both of gold and precious stones in that world, for they had larger extents of gold than our Arabian sands. Their precious stones were rocks, and their diamonds of several colors. They used no coin, but all their traffic was by exchange of several commodities. Their priests and governors were princes of the imperial blood, and made eunuchs for that purpose. And as for the ordinary sort of men in that part of the world where the emperor resided, there were of several complexions, not white, black, tawny, olive, or ash-colored, but some appeared of an azure, some of a deep purple, some of a grass green, some of a scarlet, some of an orange color, etc., which colors and complexions, whether they were made by the bare reflection of light without the assistance of small particles, or by the help of well-ranged and ordered atoms, or by a continual agitation of little globules, or by some pressing and reacting motion, I am not able to determine. The rest of the inhabitants of that world were men of several different sorts, shapes, figures, dispositions, and humors, as I have already made mention heretofore. Some were bear men, some worm men, some fish or mermen, otherwise called sirens, some bird men, some fly men, some ant men, some geese men, some spider men, some lice men, some fox men, some ape men, some jackdaw men, some magpie men, some parrot men, some satyrs, some giants, and many more, which I cannot all remember. And of these several sorts of men, each followed such a profession as was most proper for the nature of their species, which the empress encouraged them in, especially those that had applied themselves to the study of several arts and sciences, for they were as ingenious and witty in the invention of profitable and useful arts as we are in our world, nay, more. And to that end she erected schools and founded several societies. The bear men were to be her experimental philosophers, the bird men her astronomers, the fly, worm, and fish men her natural philosophers, the ape men her chemists, the satyrs her Galenic physicians, the fox men her politicians, the spider and lice men her mathematicians, the jackdaw, magpie, and parrot men her orators and logicians, the giants her architects, etc. But before all things, she, having got a sovereign power from the emperor over all the world, desired to be informed both of the manner of their religion and government. And to that end she called the priests and statesmen to give her an account of either. Of the statesmen she inquired first why they had so few laws, to which they answered that many laws made many divisions, which most commonly did breed factions, and at last break out into open wars. emperors. Next, she asked why they preferred the monarchical form of government before any other. They answered that it was as natural for one body to have but one head, so it was also natural for a politic body to have but one governor, and that a commonwealth which had many governors was like a monster with many heads. Besides, said they, a monarchy is a defined form of government, and agrees most with our religion, for as there is but one God, whom we all unanimously worship and adore with one faith, so we are resolved to have but one emperor, to whom we all submit with one obedience. Then the empress, seeing that the several sorts of her subjects had each their churches apart, asked the priests whether they were of several religions. They answered her majesty that there was no more but one religion in all that world, nor no diversity of opinions in that same religion, for though there were several sorts of men, yet had they all but one opinion concerning the worship and adoration of God. The empress asked them whether there were Jews, Turks, or Christians. We do not know, said they, what religions those are, but we do all unanimously acknowledge, worship, and adore the only omnipotent and eternal God, with all reverence, submission, and duty. Again the empress inquired whether they had several forms of worship. They answered no, for our devotion and worship consists only in prayers, which we frame according to our several necessities, in petitions, humiliations, thanksgiving, etc. Truly, replied the empress, I thought you had either been Jews or Turks, because I never perceived any women in your congregations. But what is the reason you bar them from your religious assemblies? It is not fit, said they, that men and women should be promiscuously together in time of religious worship, for their company hinders devotion, and makes many, instead of praying to God, direct their devotion to their mistresses. But, asked the empress, have they no congregation of their own to perform the duties of divine worship as well as men? No, answered they, but they stay at home and say their prayers by themselves in their closets. Then the empress desired to know the reason why the priests and governors of their world were made eunuchs. They answered, to keep them from marriage, for women and children most commonly make disturbance both in church and state. But, said she, women and children have no employment in church or state. 'Tis true, answered they, but although they are not admitted to public employments, yet are they so prevalent with their husbands and parents that many times by their importunate persuasions they cause as much, nay more, mischief secretly than if they had the management of public affairs. The empress, having received an information of what concerned both church and state, passed some time in viewing the imperial palace, where she admired much the skill and ingenuity of the architects, and inquired of them first why they built their houses no higher than 2 stories from the ground. They answered her majesty that the lower their buildings were, the less they were subject either to the heat of the sun or wind, tempest, decay, etc. Then she desired to know the reason why they made them so thick. They answered that the thicker the walls were, the warmer they were in winter, the cooler in summer, for their thickness kept out both cold and heat. Lastly, she asked why they arched their roofs and made so many pillars. They replied that arches and pillars did not only grace a building very much and caused it to appear magnificent, but made it also firm and lasting. The empress was very well satisfied with their answers, and after some time, when she thought that her new-founded societies of the virtuosos had made a good progress in the several employments she had put them upon, she caused a convocation first of the birdmen, and commanded them to give her a true relation of the 2 celestial bodies, the sun and moon, which they did with all the obedience and faithfulness befitting their duty. The sun, as much as they could observe, they related to be a firm or solid stone, of a vast bigness, of color yellowish, and of an extraordinary splendor. But the moon, they said, was of a whitish color, and although she looked dim in the presence of the sun, yet had she her own light, and was a shining body of herself, as might be perceived by her vigorous appearance in moonshiny nights. The difference only betwixt her own and the sun's light was that the sun did strike his beams in a direct line, but the moon never respected the center of their world in a right line, but her center was always eccentrical. The spots both in the sun and moon, as far as they were able to perceive, they affirmed to be nothing else but flaws and stains of their stony bodies. Concerning the heat of the sun, they were not of one opinion. Some would have the sun hot in itself, alleging an old tradition that it should at some time break asunder and burn the heavens, and consume this world into hot embers, which, said they, could not be done if the sun were not fiery of itself. Others again said this opinion could not stand with reason, for fire being a destroyer of all things, the sunstone after this manner would burn up all the near adjoining bodies. Besides, said they, fire cannot subsist without fuel, and the sunstone, having nothing to feed on, would in a short time consume itself. Wherefore they thought it more probable that the sun was not actually hot, but only by the reflection of its light, so that its heat was an effect of its light, both being immaterial. But this opinion again was laughed at by others, and rejected as ridiculous, who thought it impossible that one immaterial should produce another, and believed that both the light and heat of the sun proceeded from a swift circular motion of the ethereal globules, which by their striking upon the optic nerve caused light, and their motion produced heat. But neither would this opinion hold, for said some that it would follow that the sight of animals is the cause of light, and that were there no eyes there would be no light, which was against all sense and reason. Thus they argued concerning the heat and light of the sun. But, which is remarkable, none did say that the sun was a globous fluid body and had a swift circular motion, but all agreed it was fixed and firm like a center, and therefore they generally called it the sunstone. Then the empress asked them the reason why the sun and moon did often appear in different postures or shapes, as sometimes magnified, sometimes diminished, sometimes elevated, otherwhiles depressed, now thrown to the right and then to the left. To which some of the birdmen answered that it proceeded from the various degrees of heat and cold which are found in the air, from whence did follow a differing density and rarity, and likewise from the vapors that are interposed, whereof those that ascend are higher and less dense than the ambient air, but those which descend are heavier and more dense. But others did with more probability affirm that it was nothing else but the various patterns of the air. For like as painters do not copy out one and the same original just alike at all times, so, said they, do several parts of the air make different patterns of the luminous bodies of the sun and moon, which patterns, as several copies, the sensitive motions do figure out in the substance of our eyes. This answer the empress liked much better than the former, and inquired further what opinion they had of those creatures that are called the motes of the sun, to which they answered that they were nothing else but streams of very small, rare, and transparent particles, through which the sun was represented as through a glass. For if they were not transparent, said they would eclipse the light of the sun, and if not rare and of an airy substance, they would hinder flies from flying in the air, at least retard their flying motion. Nevertheless, although they were thinner than the thinnest vapor, yet were they not so thin as the body of air, or else they would not be perceptible by animal sight. Then the empress asked whether they were living creatures. They answered yes, because they did increase and decrease, and were nourished by the presence and starved by the absence of the sun. Having thus finished their discourse of the sun and moon, the empress desired to know what stars there were besides. But they answered that they could perceive in that world none other but blazing stars, and from thence it had the name that it was called the blazing world. And these blazing stars, said they, were such solid, firm, and shining bodies as the sun and moon, not of a globular, but of several sorts of figures. Some had tails, and some other kinds of shapes. After this, the empress asked them what kind of substance or creature the air was. The birdmen answered that they could have no other perception of the air but by their own respiration. For, said they, some bodies are only subject to touch, others only to sight, and others only to smell, but some are subject to none of our exterior senses. For nature is so full of variety that our weak senses cannot perceive all the various sorts of her creatures. Neither is there any one object perceptible by all our senses, no more than several objects are by one sense. I believe you, replied the empress, but if you can give no account of the air, said she, you will hardly be able to inform me how wind is made. For they say that wind is nothing but motion of the air. The birdmen answered that they observed wind to be more dense than air, and therefore subject to the sense of touch. But what properly wind was, and the manner how it was made, they could not exactly tell. Some said it was caused by the clouds falling on each other, and others that it was produced of a hot and dry exhalation, which ascending was driven down again by the coldness of the air that is in the middle region, and by reason of its lightness could not go directly to the bottom, but was carried by the air up and down. Some would have it a flowing water of the air, and others again a flowing air moved by the blaze of the stars. But the empress, seeing they could not agree concerning the cause of wind, asked whether they could tell her how snow was made. To which they answered that according to their observation, snow was made by a commixture of water and some certain extract of the element of fire that is under the moon, a small portion of which extract, being mixed with water and beaten by air or wind, made a white froth called snow, which being after some while dissolved by the heat of the same spirit, turned to water again. This observation amazed the empress very much, for she had hitherto believed that snow was made by cold motions, and not by such an agitation or beating of a fiery extract upon water. Nor could she be persuaded to believe it until the fish or mermen had delivered their observation upon the making of ice, which they said was not produced as some hitherto conceived by the motion of the air raking the superficies of the earth, but by some strong saline vapor arising out of the seas, which condensed water into ice. And the more quantity there was of that vapor, the greater were the mountains of precipices of ice. But the reason that it did not so much freeze in the torrid zone or under the ecliptic as near or under the poles was that this vapor in those places being drawn up by the sunbeams into the middle region of the air was only condensed into water and fell down in showers of rain, whenas under the poles, the heat of the sun being not so vehement, the same vapor had no force or power to rise so high, and therefore caused so much ice by ascending and acting only upon the surface of the water. This relation confirmed partly the observation of the birdmen concerning the cause of snow. But since they had made mention that that same extract, which by its commixture with water made snow, proceeded from the element of fire that is under the moon, the empress asked them of what nature that elementary fire was, whether it was like ordinary fire here upon earth, or such a fire as within the bowels of the earth, and as the famous mountains Vesuvius and Etna do burn withal, or whether it was such a sort of fire as is found in flints, etc. They answered that the elementary fire which is underneath the sun was not so solid as any of those mentioned fires, because it had no solid fuel to feed on, but yet it was much like the flame of ordinary fire, only somewhat more thin and fluid. For flame, said they, is nothing else but the airy part of a fired body. Lastly, the Empress asked the birdmen of the nature of thunder and lightning, and whether it was not caused by rows of ice falling upon each other. To which they answered that it was not made that way, but by an encounter of cold and heat, so that an exhalation being kindled in the clouds did dash forth lightning, and that there were so many rentings of clouds as there were sounds and cracking noises. But this opinion was contradicted by others, who affirmed that thunder was a sudden and monstrous blaze stirred up in the air, and did not always require a cloud. But the Empress, not knowing what they meant by blaze, for even they themselves were not able to explain the sense of this word, liked the former better, and to avoid hereafter tedious disputes, and have the truth of the phenomena of celestial bodies more exactly known, commanded the bearmen, which were her experimental philosophers, to observe them through such instruments as are called telescopes, which they did according to her Majesty's command. But these telescopes caused more differences and divisions amongst them than they ever had before, for some said they perceived that the sun stood still, and the earth did move about it. Others were of opinion that they both did move, and others said again that the earth stood still and sun did move. Some counted more stars than others. Some discovered new stars never seen before. Some fell into a great dispute with others concerning the bigness of the stars. Some said the moon was another world like their terrestrial globe, and the spots therein were hills and valleys. But others would have the spots to be the terrestrial parts, and the smooth and glossy parts the sea. At last the Empress commanded them to go with their telescopes to the very end of the pole that was joined to the world she came from, and try whether they could perceive any stars in it, which they did, and being returned to her Majesty, reported that they had seen 3 blazing stars appear there, one after another in a short time, whereof 2 were bright and 1 dim. But they could not agree neither of this observation, for some said it was but 1 star which appeared at 3 several times in several places, and others would have them to be 3 several stars, for they thought it impossible that those 3 several appearances should have been but 1 star, because every star did rise at a certain time and appeared in a certain place, and did disappear in the same place. Next, it is altogether improbable, said they, that 1 star should fly from place to place, especially at such a vast distance, without a visible motion, in so short a time, and appear in such different places, whereof 2 were quite opposite and the 3rd sideways. Lastly, if it had been but 1 star, said they, it would always have kept the same splendor, which it did not, for, as above mentioned, 2 were bright and 1 was dim. After they had thus argued, the Empress began to grow angry at their telescopes, that they could give no better intelligence. For, said she, now I do plainly perceive that your glasses are false informers, and instead of discovering the truth, delude your senses. Wherefore I command you to break them, and let the birdmen trust only to their natural eyes, and examine celestial objects by the motions of their own sense and reason. The bearmen replied that it was not the fault of their glasses which caused such differences in their opinions, but the sensitive motions in their optic organs did not move alike, nor were their rational judgments always regular. To which the Empress answered that if their glasses were true informers, they would rectify their irregular sense and reason. But, said she, nature has made your sense and reason more regular than art has your glasses, for they are mere deluders, and will never lead you to the knowledge of truth. Wherefore I command you again to break them, for you may observe the progressive motions of celestial bodies with your natural eyes better than through artificial glasses. The bearmen, being exceedingly troubled at Her Majesty's displeasure concerning their telescopes, kneeled down and in the humblest manner petitioned that they might not be broken. For, said they, we take more delight in artificial delusions than in natural truths. Besides, we shall want employments for our senses and subjects for our arguments. For, were there nothing but truth and no falsehood, there would be no occasion to dispute, and by this means we should want the aim and pleasure of our endeavors in confuting and contradicting each other. Neither would one man be thought wiser than another, but all would either be alike knowing and wise, or all would be fools. Wherefore we most humbly beseech your imperial majesty to spare our glasses, which are our only delight, and as dear to us as our lives. The empress at last consented to their request, but upon condition that their disputes and quarrels should remain within their schools, and cause no factions or disturbances in state or government. The bearmen, full of joy, returned their most humble thanks to the empress, and to make her amends for the displeasure which their telescopes had occasioned, told Her Majesty that they had several other artificial optic glasses, which they were sure would give Her Majesty a great deal more satisfaction. Amongst the rest, they brought forth several microscopes, by the means of which they could enlarge the shapes of little bodies, and make a louse appear as big as an elephant, and a mite as big as a whale. First of all, they showed the empress a gray dronefly, wherein they observed that the greatest part of her face, nay, of her head, consisted of two large bunches all covered over with a multitude of small pearls or hemispheres in a trigonal order, which pearls were of 2 degrees, smaller and bigger. The smaller degree was lowermost, and looked towards the ground. The other was upward, and looked sideward, forward, and backward. They were all so smooth and polished that they were able to represent the image of any object. The number of them was in all 14,000. After the view of this strange and miraculous creature and their several observations upon it, the empress asked them what they judged those little hemispheres might be. They answered that each of them was a perfect eye, by reason they perceived that each was covered with a transparent cornea, containing a liquor within them which resembled the watery or glassy humor of the eye. To which the empress replied that they might be glassy pearls and yet not eyes, and that perhaps their microscopes did not truly inform them. But they smilingly answered Her Majesty that she did not know the virtue of those microscopes, for they never delude, but rectify and inform the senses. Nay, the world, said they, would be but blind without them, as it has been in former ages, before those microscopes were invented. After this, they took a charcoal, and viewing it with one of their best microscopes, discovered in it an infinite multitude of pores, some bigger, some less, so close and thick that they left but very little space betwixt them to be filled with a solid body. And to give Her Imperial Majesty a better assurance thereof, they counted in a line of them an inch long, no less than 2,700 pores, from which observation they drew this following conclusion, to wit, that this multitude of pores was the cause of the blackness of the coal. For, said they, a body that has so many pores, from each of which no light is reflected, must necessarily look black, since black is nothing else but a privation of light, or a want of reflection. But the empress replied that if all colors were made by reflection of light, and that black was as much a color as any other color, then certainly they contradicted themselves in saying that black was made by want of reflection. However, not to interrupt your microscopical inspections, said she, let us see how vegetables appear through your glasses. Whereupon they took a nettle, and by the virtue of the microscope discovered that underneath the points of the nettle there were certain little bags or bladders containing a poisonous liquor. And when the points had made way into the interior parts of the skin, they, like syringe pipes, served to convey that same liquor into them. To which observation the Empress replied, that if there were such poison in nettles, then certainly in eating of them they would hurt us inwardly as much as they do outwardly. But they answered that it belonged to physicians more than to experimental philosophers to give reasons hereof, for they only made microscopical inspections and related the figures of the natural parts of creatures according to the representation of their glasses. Lastly, they showed the Empress a flea and a louse, which creatures through the microscope appeared so terrible to her sight that they had almost put her into a swoon. The description of all their parts would be very tedious to relate, and therefore I'll forbear it at the present. The Empress, after the view of those strangely shaped creatures, pitied much those that are molested with them, especially poor beggars, which although they have nothing to live on themselves, are yet necessitated to maintain and feed of their own flesh and blood a company of such terrible creatures called lice, who, instead of thanks, do reward them with pains and torment them for giving them nourishment and food. But after the Empress had seen the shapes of these monstrous creatures, she desired to know whether their microscopes could hinder their biting, or at least show some means how to avoid them. To which they answered that such arts were mechanical and below the noble study of microscopical observations. Then the Empress asked them whether they had not such sorts of glasses that could enlarge and magnify the shapes of great bodies as well as they had done of little ones. Whereupon they took one of their best and largest microscopes and endeavored to view a whale through it. But alas, the shape of the whale was so big that its circumference went beyond the magnifying quality of the glass. Whether the error proceeded from the glass or from the wrong position of the whale against the reflection of light, I cannot certainly tell. The Empress, seeing the insufficiency of those magnifying glasses, that they were not able to enlarge all sorts of objects, asked the bearmen whether they could not make glasses of a contrary nature to those they showed her, to wit, such as instead of enlarging or magnifying the shape or figure of an object, could contract it beneath its natural proportion, which, in obedience to her Majesty's commands, they did, and viewing through one of the best of them, a huge and mighty whale appeared no bigger than a sprat, nay, through some, no bigger than a vinegar eel, and through their ordinary ones, an elephant seemed no bigger than a flea, a camel no bigger than a louse, and an ostrich no bigger than a mite. To relate all their optic observations through the several sorts of their glasses would be a tedious work, and tire even the most patient reader, wherefore I'll pass them by. Only this was very remarkable and worthy to be taken notice of, that notwithstanding their great skill, industry, and ingenuity in experimental philosophy, they could yet by no means contrive such glasses by the help of which they could spy out a vacuum with all its dimensions, nor immaterial substances, non-beings and mixed beings, or such as are between something and nothing, which they were very much troubled at, hoping that yet in time, by long study and practice, they might perhaps attain to it. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the description of a new world called The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle. What a marvelously imaginative and curious mind she had. I can only wonder what she would have discovered if she'd had the opportunity to be a scientist. As it is, Her reputation as one of the mothers of science fiction and fantasy is a great deal in and of itself. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, you'll find a link to it on our Goodreads page, where we keep a library of everything read on this podcast. Just go to www.goodreads.com/boringbooksforbedtime. I highly recommend this. It's a lot of fun. If you'd like to support this podcast, we do have a Patreon account. Just go to www.patreon.com/boringbookspod to find out about exclusive perks for supporters. It would be much appreciated. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter @boringbookspod. I love hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.